Hello everyone, I am Rhonda and welcome to a new video. Today I am going over the 16 books I have read in the month of October. Now for those of you who have watched my previous videos, then you know that I have been fighting a reading slump for the past couple of months, and I am proud to say that as of October I have officially gotten over that reading slump. I read 3 books back to back to back that pulled me out of that slump, and I am so grateful for it. Okay, so before I get into these books, I do want to go over just a few stats. First, again, I read 16 books. 2 of those books I did sadly DNF, and I had an average Goodreads score of 3.21. So it was not awesome, but I did have 1 5-star read this month, as well as 6 4-star reads. So this month really wasn't terrible in terms of finding some good books to recommend to you guys. Also, know that it was October, so I did try to focus more on some of the spookier seasonal books, but the genres I did read include historical fiction, thrillers, horror, contemporary romance, adult fantasy, and I did read 1 cozy mystery. So I really did read a huge variety of books this month, and I love that. I did not feel like I was reading the same type of genre over and over and over again. And then finally, of the 7 books that I picked for this month's TBR, I read about, Sorry, I needed to put those books down. What was I saying? Finally, let's talk about the 7 books that I picked for this month's TBR. I will post them here on the screen. I read 6 of them, which is amazing, but I was really striving and hoping to read that last book. I really wanted to read all 7 books, but sadly it didn't happen, so I did send that last book back on the TBR cart. All right, let's go ahead and talk about the books that I read. I do want to quickly go over the 2 books that I DNF'd. The first one is Half a Soul by Olivia Atwater, and this one is a YA fantasy. I'm not sure if it's a YA fantasy romance. I didn't get that far into it, but I had heard really good things about this one. It is heavily hyped up. It is set in Regency England, which I loved, and it is about a girl whose mother made a deal with a Dark Lord previously, and when the main character, Theodora, was a child, that Dark Lord comes to collect her soul as that payment, but he is interrupted in the process and only takes half her soul. So now it is, present Regency time. She is a young adult now, and because she only has half a soul, she is kind of odd and socially handicapped. And listen, I love the plot of this book. I just didn't mesh well at all with the writing, sadly. I've read Jane Austen books and tons of historical romance books that are set in the Regency period, and the writing in this book was just so strange and odd to me. I could not get past it, so I had to sadly DNF it. This is, as I mentioned, a very hyped up book, so I might be an outlier. Just know that people love this book, they love this series, but I will not be continuing the series. It's just strange to me, so I DNF'd it. The last book I DNF'd is Wolf Gone Wild by Juliet Cross. This is a paranormal contemporary romance featuring a werewolf and a witch. This one is about a man who has a curse put on him, so he can't shapeshift into a werewolf as he's supposed to once a month. And so he goes and meets with the main character in here, who is a witch, with the hopes that she can break the spell. Now, the problem I had with this book is the main male character's inner dialogue that included his werewolf persona, and he was called Alpha Dog. So anytime Alpha Dog was part of his inner dialogue, it drove me up the wall, just because that part of his being, I guess, is just terrible. That part of the inner dialogue was just crude, and all he talked about was sex and women and fighting. He was just a really foul, I want to say, it's not a character, it's his inner dialogue. That's the best way I know how to describe it. And I just could not get past it, and I ended up kind of flipping through the book to see if it got any better, and sadly it didn't. So I had to DNF it just because I really hated that part of his character, and I found it very distracting and off-putting. So that's why I DNF'd it, but I have heard this entire series is pretty good. So if you have read any other books in this series, please let me know in the comments if you think I should try another book, and let me know which one I should try, because I feel bad that this one just wasn't for me, and I do kind of want to read more, but I don't want to DNF another book that I paid for, if that makes sense. So this one just really wasn't for me at all. I did not like that inner dialogue, and so for that reason, I DNF'd it. Okay, so let's get to the 14 books that I did finish. And the first one I read is A Court of Mist and Fury by the Queen, Sarah J. Maas. I gave this one 4 stars. This is actually the second book in the ACOTAR series, as some of you are already familiar with and know. My goal is actually to finish this entire series before the end of the year. So I have 1, 2, 3 books to get through before December 31st. So I'll do it because I am enjoying this series. And I am doing a reading vlog on this entire series, so I'm not going to talk about this at all here, but just know I absolutely enjoyed and adored this book. It was so good. The second book I read was An Enchanting Case of the Spirits by Melissa Holtz, and sadly I did not love this one, and I gave it, I hate to say this, I gave it 1 star. I struggled to get through this one, and I probably should have DNF'd it, which is why I gave it 1 star. So this one is a paranormal romance with a little bit of a mystery. This is about Alyssa, who is a widow because she and her husband were involved in a car accident over a year ago, with her husband sadly dying from that accident. So one day she goes to a psychic with some friends in order to speak to her dead husband to hopefully get her to move on. However, she ends up seeing dead people, and these dead people, these ghosts, are seeking her help to help her move to the other side. Also, there is, this is where the romance comes in, there is a hunky single neighbor who works as a detective. With this one, I found myself pretty bored with it, and I just did not care about the characters, and I did not care about the outcome of the mystery. I also really did not like Alyssa, the main character. I get that she went through something pretty horrific with the death of her husband, and she is grieving and trying to deal with that. But she is incredibly awful to her friends and her loved ones, and even when you're grieving, it doesn't give you an excuse to be terrible to the people who are trying to help you. I think one of the ghosts even refers to her as a Karen, so that should tell you something. Also, when it came to the romance between her and Nick, who is the hunky neighbor, I did not feel the chemistry whatsoever, and I was not rooting for them as a couple just because Alyssa was so unlikable. So for all those reasons, I gave it 1 star. Again, this is a book I really should have DNF'd. Next up, I read Wrong Place, Wrong Time by Gillian McAllister. This one is a mystery thriller with time travel or a time loop, and you guys already know that I love a good time warp book. So I was really hoping to love this one, and it was okay. I gave it 3 stars. So this one is about a woman named Jen who on Halloween, she sees her son shoot and kill a man outside their house for what appears to be no apparent reason. And when Jen wakes up the next day, it is not the next day or the following day, it is the day before the murder happened, which means she has an opportunity to stop the murder before it actually happens and to find out what's going on. Also, each time Jen goes to sleep, she wakes up further back in the past, and this sounded like it was right up my alley just because I love those type of books, and I did enjoy most of it. Probably the first half I was enjoying, but the problem I had with it is it just was not executed well. It was slightly confusing in the second half, and the ending was a little anticlimactic. And overall, it just got to be over the top with how far back Jen goes. And there's also kind of, as part of the plot of the book, there's a little bit of a crime element that I don't typically like in books. So for me, I just don't think the second half of the book was enjoyable. Like I said, I did enjoy the first half, the second half, not as much. So this one was placed in the just okay category with 3 stars. I do know other people have enjoyed this book, so take my opinion with a grain of salt, but for me, it was a 3-star read. Next, I read a book by one of my favorite horror authors, and that is The Haunting of Lee Harker by Darcy Coates. This one sadly completely missed the mark for me, and I have to say that it is one of my least favorite books by this author. So Darcy Coates writes really fantastic haunted house themed spooky creepy books, and this one definitely was a haunted spooky book, but it is another book where I was just incredibly bored with. So this one is about Lee Harker, who is kind of a homebody. She pretty much keeps to herself, but one night she starts experiencing some pretty terrifying things. Some spooky and creepy things are happening in her home, and they seem to get worse each day. That's the gist of it, and that's really all I can tell you. And first off, this book is almost all description and internal monologue with very, very little dialogue, which I do not like in books. I always find those books boring. I get incredibly bored just reading description after description, inner dialogue after inner dialogue. I need something to break that up. I just have trouble getting through those books. So that's one of the reasons why I didn't like it, and one of the reasons why I found it boring, because I can only read so much description before I'm just done. And that's really kind of where I was with this one. Also, there is a plot twist, a pretty big one, pretty early on, and I saw it coming from a mile away. So it was not anything spectacular. And this one just is not one of my favorites by her. If you do like haunted house books and haven't read Darcy Coates before, please do. She really is good. I would just stay away from this one, and I would suggest you try The Haunting of Ashburn House and Craven Manor. Those were my first two books that I read by her, and I really love them and recommend them often. This one just wasn't for me, and I gave this one 2 stars. Now, at this point, I was reading books that just were either not good or just kind of mid-level. They just really were not hitting it for me. They were not helping me with my reading slump, and they were actually probably making it worse. So I decided to read a book that was on my TBR for October that I thought would really help me get out of that slump, and I picked up Wild Love by Elsie Silver. I loved this book so much, and in fact, this book and then the 2 books after this book that I read are the 3 books that pulled me out of my reading slump. So this one is a small town, billionaire, single dad, brother's best friend, frenemy to lover, contemporary romance. So there's a lot of tropes in this book, and it all works very, very well. For those of you who don't know, Elsie Silver has written 2 interconnected series. I have not read the first series, but the other one I read was the Chestnut Spring series. I'm sure some of you have heard about this series, and I did enjoy that series, but it was just a little bit too spicy for me, and I was worried about starting this new series by her just because of some of the spiciness I had trouble getting through with the other series, and I'm so glad that I gave this a chance. It is still spicy, but I feel like she held herself back a little bit. She was not as crude and as vulgar as she was with those spicy scenes in the previous Chestnut Spring series. As I said, this is book 1 in a new interconnected series featuring small town single dads. This one is about Ford, who is the brother of, I think, Willa from the Chestnut Spring series, and he is a billionaire. He's super rich, and he is opening a recording studio in the fictional small town of Rose Hill, which is where he also grew up. One day, a 12-year-old knocks on his door and tells him she is his daughter. At the same time, all this is happening, his best friend's sister moves back to town, and he ends up hiring her to help him at the studio. So while he is kind of dealing with the news of being a dad, he is also fighting his feelings for Rosie, who he kind of has a frenemy history with. So this one had a lot of angst, a lot of banter, and I ate it up. Not only that, but to me, a good dad is incredibly attractive. I really love that about Ford in here. He was really trying to be a good dad and just get used to that idea and be there for his daughter. I really also enjoyed the chemistry of Rosie and Ford and their dynamics. They also had just these really cute and funny professional emails that they would send to each other. It had me laughing and giggling. I do have the second book in this series, which features West, who is Rosie's brother, and I can't wait to read that next. But I gave this one 4 stars. I was really surprised by how much I enjoyed this. I kind of felt like this was going to be kind of like a 3-star read, like most of the books in the Chestnut Spring series. But Elsie Silver really is a great writer. She knows how to write romance, and I really enjoyed it. And for all those reasons, I gave this one 4 stars. The next book that I read and loved was a contemporary romance called The Off-Limits Rule by Sarah Adams. This was previously published by the author when she was an indie author, but it is now part of just a backlist of books that are being re-edited and re-released by her publisher. I did read the 2 previously re-released books. I think it was The Match and The Enemy. And I thought they were okay. I enjoyed them, but I feel like they weren't the same as some of her newer books. And because of that, I kind of went into this one with low expectations, just thinking it was going to be another 3-star read. But I surprisingly love this one. This one is about Lucy, who is a single mom to her son, and she has moved back into town with her son after hitting rock bottom. She actually moves in with her brother just because she is so broke that she can't afford her own place. And soon after, she meets her brother's best friend, Cooper, who she is instantly attracted to, but because it is her brother's best friend, she knows that he's off limits. So she tries her best not to catch feelings. I feel like maybe this is the book where Sarah Adams found her writing style and her voice, if that makes sense. I love a good quirky female character, and the author really nailed it with Lucy's quirkiness. This is a little bit of a slow burn, but I didn't mind it at all. I just really enjoyed this book. And also, if you're not familiar with this author, just know that Sarah Adams does write clean romances. So if you're looking for just a sweet romance that's kind of a palate cleanser, where it's more about the relationship than the lusty, spicy plot, then this would be for you. If you prefer really spicy books, you may not like this. Sarah Adams just writes really good book candy. Anyway, I gave this book 4 stars, and I cannot wait to read the next book in this series called The Temporary Roomie, which was released the other day, and I actually just got my hands on a copy. Can't wait to read it, but seriously, if you have not read anything from this author, please do. She has quickly become one of my favorite authors. All right, moving on to a book that's very, very different, and that is The Night Andale by Kristen Hanna. This is a World War II historical fiction, and it is about 2 sisters who live in France, and it follows their journey during World War II and how their lives were impacted by the German occupation of their small town that's set just outside of Paris. And it's also about what they did to secretly help the war effort. I do need to say that this is one of 2 books that have been on my TBR piles for years. This is actually a first edition, if that tells you anything. It's been on that TBR pile for a long, long time, and I never read it because I don't read a ton of historical fiction, and this one is also incredibly long, and I had heard that this is a very sad book. But with my prompt jar picks, my October TBR video, this was one of the books that was selected, and I'm so glad I read this. I really enjoyed this. The writing is incredible. The story was captivating. I could not put this book down. I was so invested in what was happening to their community and the lives of these sisters. I will say when I got to the last few pages, this was kind of a 4-star read only because I was expecting to be bawling my eyes out throughout this entire book, and I had not shed a tear yet. But just you wait. Once I finished this book, I was crying so hard. My shoulders were shaking, and I had my hands covering my eyes just to try to stop the flow of tears. This was so heartbreaking. I was so just, my heart was just ripped out of my chest. And I know this is a fictional story. I know these are fictional characters, but the reality is people like these 2 sisters really did exist, and horrific and unimaginable things did happen to people like these women and the people of this town. And I just cannot imagine what difficult choices people like them had to make and how they lived through such brutality at this time. Anyway, I did end up giving this book a 5-star, and I definitely want to read more books by Kristen Hanna and just other historical fiction books in general. If there are any historical fictions that you really love that you think I should read, please let me know in the comments, specifically books with World War II as a setting. I've always watched a lot of documentaries about World War II, and I just find that time period very, very interesting. Next, I read a brand new cozy mystery called A Grim Reaper's Guide to Catching a Killer by Maxie Dara. So here you are following a human Grim Reaper named Kathy. This is set during modern times, and she needs to collect and transport the soul of a teenager. However, once she finds him, he won't let her collect and transport his soul until she solves his murder. The catch is she does have a limited amount of time to do this, because I think if she doesn't transport his soul within like 40 days or so, he becomes a permanent ghost, which is apparently really, really bad. So I thought that this book was just a fun, cozy mystery, and I had a great time with it. I really enjoyed the dark humor. I also liked the setup because it had a unique take on the Grim Reaper idea in modern times. Kathy essentially works for a corporation, and she has a supervisor, she has a manager. There's this whole hierarchy. She has co-workers. It's just a really interesting Grim Reaper in an office setting type situation. So I did find this one a little slow moving, which is kind of the case with most cozy mysteries that I read, and it was slightly predictable. But I loved the found family, the humor, and the journey of solving this mystery. I had a good time with it. I gave this one 3 stars. It was fine. I had a great time with it. And I do believe that this is book 1 and it's going to be part of a series. I'm not sure where it goes after this, but I do think I would read the next book in the series when it is released. Next up is The Haunting of Maddie CLA by Simone St. James. This one is a spooky, supernatural horror book with a little bit of a thriller subplot and a little bit of historical fiction, and also surprisingly a little bit of a romance, which I was not expecting at all. So this book is set in the 1920s, and it is about Sarah, who works for a temp agency and is hired by a wealthy ghost hunter named Alistair, I think that's how you pronounce it. With this job, he needs Sarah to go with him to investigate the ghost of Maddie CLA, who is pretty violent towards men. So Sarah needs to interact with Maddie and try and record her ghostly hauntings or whatever. Sarah is obviously a little bit concerned about this job just because it's a little odd, but she does need the money, so she agrees to it. I really enjoyed this ghost story. It was incredibly creepy at times and very atmospheric, which is usually the case with Simone St. James books. I didn't find it scary, but it was definitely creepy and thrilling at times. The writing was amazing, as is the case with most of her books. And also I thought the pacing was great too. There's many scenes with Maddie that kind of helped the flow of the story. I also enjoyed the fact that it had so many genres and it was able to do that well. I have read books before that tried to mesh a bunch of different genres together and it just did not work. There was no identity for the book, but this one, I don't know what Simone St. James did, but it really worked with this book. It was just a very well balanced book. Now, I have read most books by this author, and I have loved them all in their own way. My favorite book by Simone St. James has always been The Sundown Motel. I've always recommended that book, but this, dare I say, might even be better than that one. Now, this one is one of her earlier books, and I have found that I do enjoy books that she has written earlier even more than some of her recent releases. That's not to say that her newer books aren't good. They are. They're just a little bit different, if that makes sense. As I mentioned, I have loved all of her books in one way or another. I just know that I love her older books even more. I gave this book 4 stars. I really enjoyed it. I thought it was fantastic. And I would say if you have not read anything from Simone St. James, then you can either pick up this one or The Sundown Motel. Those are my 2 favorites so far. The next book I read, I actually do not have a copy of it just because it was a library book that I had to return, but it is a short novella called Haunt Sweet Home by Sarah Pinsker, and this is another paranormal horror book that I had high hopes for this month, and sadly, it was very much underwhelming. I didn't like it. This is about Mara, who works the night shift for a kind of a reality show, and by day the show is kind of like one of those home makeover shows, and then by night it is a ghost hunter type show where the homeowner and the host investigate the home's history and any possible hauntings. So it's kind of like a home makeover by day, ghost hunter by night, if that makes sense. Anyway, Mara is in charge of kind of faking these hauntings to scare the audience of the show as well as the homeowners, but soon she learns that she does not need to fake the hauntings. Hey, listen, I really love the plot idea of this book. I thought it had a unique idea. I just did not find it spooky or creepy whatsoever. It kind of read more like a book about self-reflection of the main character more than anything. I did like that it was a quick read. It only had 150-ish pages, but outside of that, I just really did not enjoy anything else, and for that reason, I gave it 2 stars. Next up is a book that went a little bit viral last month, and that is the dark fantasy romance called Fantasma by Kayla Smith. I'm not going to tell you what it's about. It's a little bit confusing to explain, and I think if you're interested, you've either heard about this already or you can go on Goodreads and read the synopsis. But first, I did enjoy it. It was fun, and it is a decent gothic fantasy romance. I enjoyed the trials and the competition the most in this because it was different due to the paranormal or the supernatural elements to it. Outside of that, I did get a little bit bored with it, and when I got bored, it was usually during the moments when the competition was not part of the plot, especially during the romance scenes. I felt that this book was very lust-filled. There was no emotions involved in the romance. It didn't feel organic, if that makes sense. The romance felt odd and forced. Outside of the romance, another problem I had with this book was with some of the trials. I was really into those scenes, but I felt like those scenes were so quick, and they were wrapped up so quickly that it left me a little frustrated. I wanted to read more about what was happening and how she's getting through it. Also, the pacing of this book was a little bit off. This is a 500-page book, and the ending wrapped up way too quickly and way too easy. And I think with a book that's about 500 pages, that should not be the case. You have plenty of time to give it a full and deserving ending. Finally, I do have quite a few questions about the world building and the plot that were not included. As for the plot twist, yes, there were some, but it was not shocking. It was a little bit predictable. I was not caught off guard by the main plot twist at the end. I was kind of expecting it. So again, I did like the trials of this competition that the characters had to face. I did enjoy the banter of the romance between the two main characters in here. Also, the writing was fine, and I did enjoy the New Orleans setting and the idea of this book. But for me, it is a 3-star book, and I would recommend it. Just know that this is a little bit overhyped in my opinion, and if you lower your expectations some, you might enjoy this more than I did. Next, I read an ARC ebook through NetGalley called Is She Really Going Out With Him by Sophie Cousins. This is a contemporary romance that is being released on November 19th, and I really enjoyed most of this book. This one follows a divorced magazine columnist named Anna, and in order to increase the viewership of the magazine and the column, she agrees to a dating competition of sorts. There is a little bit of a unique take on this just because her children are picking the men she goes out on dates with. Now, in turn, one of her colleagues is a guy named Will who she really doesn't get along with. They kind of butt heads a little bit, and she's kind of in competition with him all the time. But he's also going to write a dating column, but the flip side is he's going to do the male's take on dating in the modern age with dates found through online dating apps. Hopefully that all made sense, but I was really enjoying this, and I was flying through it up until the 70% mark. I loved our main character, Anna, and I love the fact that she is a little bit older. I believe she's 38, and which is usually older than some contemporary romance heroines, and I appreciated that. I also enjoy that she was dealing with some real problems. She's divorced and a mom of 2 kids. She's trying to keep her job, and I also love Will because you can tell he was all in with Anna, and I loved his little acts of service. And you also need to know that this is an age gap book where she is older than him by several years. So overall, this was a cute and funny contemporary romance. I laughed often, and I did a lot of sighing and giggling. I loved the reverse age gap. I enjoyed the children as characters in this book as well. So unfortunately, around the 70-ish% mark, I started to get bored, which seems to be a common theme with some of these books I read this month, but it did seem to slow down quite a bit, and I really just did not like the third act conflict. It felt incredibly forced by the author, which is why I ended up giving this book 3.5 stars instead of 4 stars. This is my second book by Sophie Cousins, and I don't think it is her best. I love the book The Good Part better, so go check it out if you haven't already. But in regards to this book, it was still enjoyable, and I did really enjoy it and would recommend it to everyone. Just suspend your disbeliefs just a little bit with this one and sit back and be entertained. It was decent. I only have 2 more books, guys. We're almost there. But I next read a gothic fantasy called The Starling House by Alex E. Harrow. This is about a character named Opal who gets a cleaning job at this infamous and sinister home in her small town. Soon she discovers there is a dark mystery of the house and the previous owners that she kind of needs to solve. Well, she doesn't need to solve it. She's interested in finding out what's happening. First off, as you all probably have recognized, I do love a good spooky haunted house story. And I did enjoy this one because there was a mystery to solve. However, I really did not like it. Right off the bat, the writing is very, very good. I really enjoy that, so I'm not going to knock that part at all. It was truly written beautifully. But there was just way too much description and inner turmoil, which caused it to get, again, boring. The ending was also a little bit odd to me. There was also these weird footnotes that really was not needed in the story and didn't add anything else to it. So this book, it just was not for me. Also, there was a little bit of a romance, which I was not expecting. It did seem a little bit forced, but it was still sweet and cute, so I will give it that. But I gave this one 2 stars. I didn't enjoy it like I thought I would, and it's not a book that I would recommend to others. All right, finally, I ended my October reading journey with a bang with the last book I read called Wayward by Amelia Hart. I love this one so much more than I thought I would. This one follows 3 women in 3 different POVs and is set in 3 different time periods. One POV is about a woman set in modern times, and she is trying to escape an abusive relationship, and she seeks refuge in a cottage that she has inherited from her great aunt. The other POV is that of a 16-year-old set in the 1950s, and then the last POV is of a woman set in the 1600s who I believe, and the last one is set in the 1600s, I believe, and that one is of a woman who is on trial for being a witch. So these three stories come together as the lives of these three women are interconnected in some way. And I have to say, I could not put this book down. It was so interesting and well written. I was completely invested in the lives of these women and what was happening to them. This is a little bit of a witchy historical fiction. I love the independence, the do-for-yourself themes, and the strength that these women had to overcome obstacles in their lives and to just do for themselves. Apparently this is a debut novel, which surprised me because this really did read like a seasoned writer wrote this. I thought it had great pacing. I love the character growth of all three characters, and the writing was incredible. I will say there are a couple of things in here I had trouble reading just because of what was going on with the characters. It was tough to get through, and it was hard at times, but again, I really enjoy this, and I gave this a strong 4 stars. If you haven't read it, I really encourage all you ladies out there to read this immediately. This just had a really great message of womanhood and independence that I really enjoy reading about. All right, my friends, those were all the books that I read, and even though my average score this month was on the lower side, I read some really amazing books, and I love that I read so many different genres. If you have read any of these books, please let me know in the comments what you thought about them, and also let me know what was your favorite book from October. For me, I would have to say The Night Andale was my #1 favorite, and Wayward and Wild Love will come in at 2nd and 3rd. Those 3 books were just amazing for me. Anyway, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe if you haven't already. Thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next one. Bye.